generation growth. So as you all, I'm sure, are aware, and many on this in this panel are aware, the growth in non-hydro renewables has been quite substantial over the last decade. Even in the last few years, it's been quite substantial. But that said, the U.S. still only gets about 15% of its total generation from non-hydro sources. That's less than coal, that's less than nuclear, that's about half of what, it's not even half of what natural gas is. So clearly, if we're reaching for some goal of a decarbonized electricity sector, we have a long ways to go. And so the question that I would love to hear your all comments on is, given that we still have a long ways to go, what are some of the technical and non-technical barriers that you foresee for greater renewable deployment? So since you're our latest to join, let's start with you, Dr. Kammen, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, and we'll pass it around to the other folks.
Sure enough. So, normally I wait till later in the panel to kind of throw a kind of lob a grenade into the conversation, but I think I'll just start with it. And that is, I'm a physicist by training. I've done most of my career in doing material science for solar and batteries, building very elaborate so-called capacity expansion models, meaning you look at the grid in a given area and see where it's going to go. And now that renewables are demonstrably cheaper than fossil fuels, there's this famous Bloomberg quote, it's now cheaper to build new renewables than to operate existing fossil. The old world, we thought somehow everything's going to pivot. Somehow, that's the victory signal. And I would argue that's just the opening salvo. And the reason why is, and it's the answer to the question, at least for me, and that is that only now are we beginning to fully understand what it means to be so addicted to fossil fuels up and down the economy. Basically, every billionaire except for just a very few new ones, made their billions in fossils, not in renewables. The amount we subsidize fossil fuels currently globally is more than we invest in renewables. And that was always there, but it's so different when we look at why aren't we just simply picking renewables projects time and time again in every situation? Why is my governor in California sort of one of the greenest, if not the greenest state, depending how you do your math, now talking about giving away $400, $800 per person to offset the higher gas prices, when 30 days ago, he announced a $10 billion investment in electric vehicles. And these are all have to do with subsidies and legacies and getting elected. And so I would say the reason why renewables aren't just literally dominating the scene is that we're only now beginning to appreciate the environmental injustice, the racial issues, the financial holdings, the drags we have on our economy based on where we've come from. Now, all of that said, being 10 or 15% renewables doesn't sound like the 100% that we need it to be. But going from 0.1% to 1% is critical, but going from 1% to 10% is the really critical piece, because now there's a real business case to be made. And everything before today was in the world of subsidies. Now we're in a world where we have to really duke it out with the dying economy. And that has never been easy any point in human history. So solar is cheap, wind is cheap, batteries are getting cheaper faster than solar and wind ever have. The US is also decades behind in building offshore wind. So we've got lots of things brewing, but now we have to fight the much more ugly, the much more non-technical battle.
Tyler, thoughts on this?
Yeah, and first off, I think that was incredibly well said. And so what I'll try to do is bring the venture capital investor, technologist lens to this discussion. One of the things that we're very focused on as an investor in asset-light businesses that can dramatically drive forward the adoption of renewable energy, there's sort of three categories that we're thinking about a lot today. That is, one, soft costs. How do we squash down the soft costs that have become pervasive in solar, but increasingly are affecting batteries, EV charging, and these other technologies as the hardware costs come down. And that's related to permitting, financing, customer acquisition. There's a number of areas that we think software and data-driven approaches can really dramatically bring those costs down. The next is transmission and interconnection. I mean, in the United States, we've gone from effectively 1 year to now more than 4 years in order to interconnect a utility scale wind, solar, or battery facility. If we want to come anywhere close to achieving our deployment targets for renewables, we need to figure out a way both to build more transmission, but also to do more with the existing transmission that we have. And that can be done with digital technologies, software, and then, frankly, we do need to build a lot of transmission, which has been near impossible in this country for years. And then last but not least, what I would identify is sort of supply chain and material or mineral access. I think this has come into light in a dramatic way in the past few weeks here. But we really need to build out a resilient supply chain for solar and battery materials specifically here in the US. And we need to have a better understanding where are those materials and minerals coming from. And we've actually been an investor in a company that helps map the supply chain, both for labor purposes, but emissions and other factors that are going to come into play in order to drive that supply chain to net zero as well. So that's where I would start off as some of the barriers that we're thinking about.
Great. Neeraj?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, certainly good foundation with both the panelists here, right? I mean, just the other thing I would add is, on a Wood Mackenzie perspective, right, we have our own scenario that we put out for a 1.5 degree pathway. And there are sort of 5 key enabling things in there, right? One, both the panelists hinted at already, right, is policy designs, right? Whether it's carbon pricing or whether it's just barriers from a policy perspective for market entry, whether it's regulatory, commercial, technical, that have to be removed. And there's a lot of policy barriers that still exist. So we need to take care of that and incentivize the market participants, one, to actually get after the innovative solutions necessary and tackle the systemic challenges, one of which is obviously transmission and distribution and the long interconnection queues we see, right? That's one. Two is capital. Our estimate for our accelerated energy transition for the 1.5 degree pathway suggests we need about 47 trillion, and I'm not talking just US, I'm talking worldwide, but we're talking $47 trillion of capital by 2050. So the question we do have to ask is, while there is a lot of investment going on everywhere, do we really have enough money to go after every one of these things? And right now, it seems like we don't really have enough money, right? And we need both private and public sector and governments to actually crowd in the investment that is necessary, one from the government side, to then help attract the private investment, right? So that's a lot of money we need. Technology, well, we talk about wind and solar, but as has been said plenty of times, right, that alone is not going to be enough to decarbonize the grid. There are a lot of barriers beyond policy. There is societal acceptance barriers for nuclear, even for geothermal. I mean, let alone nuclear, right? Even geothermal, there is barriers for, sort of not in my backyard. There's hydrogen, there's other things. So we need to do that. And most importantly, right now for decarbonization is getting to a cost structure that allows the system storage and system flexibility technologies to come into the grid architecture and help balance. And the balancing is going to become very complex, right? Tyler referenced software, even software or technologies that will allow us to pinpoint precisely where the surplus is in energy and where the deficit is, right? So we can then get about moving those things. So there's 5 sort of things that we see that on paper, you can get to 1.5 degrees, but these things are necessary to make that happen.
Yeah. Michael, your thoughts?
So I'll start with a positive note, which is I believe we are seeing a step change in the rate of growth in renewables. And as Dan noted, getting to where we are was the big push, but it has created a platform to grow from. And I think we're going to see pretty rapid acceleration. The other good news is, at least in solar, innovation continues to drive longevity of panels, the efficiency of panels. There's some really interesting innovations being done on the manufacturing side to take out some of the more energy intensive and capital intensive steps in the ingot wafer production process that are critical. And so this is all good news. But I think Tyler hit on something that is, from our perspective, very, very important, which is the highly concentrated and unsustainable supply chains that underlie some of these sources of energy. China spent the last decade using industrial policy to capture many of these supply chains with all of the ways they do. And in solar now, they control manufacturing capacity between 75 and 98% for each of the steps in the solar supply chain. That is a deeply, deeply leveraged strategic energy resource now, with a strategic, not partner, shall we say. And there are some significant sustainability problems that brings as well. And people don't necessarily realize that all the solar that comes out of China is made with coal-fired power. And coal-fired solar is just a bizarre bit of irony, but that's the case. And so significant carbon emissions in the solar supply chain in China. We've all read about the forced labor problems in Xinjiang, and those sustainability challenges are contributing to supply problems that risk that exuberant growth that I was just talking about. And so I do think solar customers are beginning to understand that they need a much more resilient, distributed, and sustainable solar supply chain to meet their goals. And we're seeing the beginning of that change. We're seeing much more investment go into the US, into Europe, India. And Neeraj mentioned policy, and I'll close with that. It is really important. These are deeply capital intensive industries. To compete with the Chinese producers, you need to manufacture at multi-gigawatt scale, otherwise just kind of playing around. These are, anywhere between $500 million to $3 billion facilities. And that there's a lot of capital in the world, but that's still a lot of money. And policy can really help to buy down that risk. So India has a production linked incentives program that looks like it's going to fairly quickly stand up a roughly 50 gigawatt end-to-end supply chain in India. Reliance Industries is talking about 100 gigawatt supply chain in India. There's a very similar piece of legislation here in the US called the Solar Energy Manufacturing for America Act. It was part of Build Back Better. It basically says you got 5 years to scale up as fast as you can to get these incentives, which is a great package that says build fast, which is what we need. And so I think the final thing I would say is buyers have a really big role here. If buyers start demanding better solar, that means building it in low carbon economies like the US. That means a better supply chain at the end of the day, and that helps to reduce the supply risk.
Yes, certainly. So I want to come back to an idea that many of you mentioned, and I think that we all understand is a big part of this as well, which is transmission. As again, most on this call are probably aware of, and certainly everybody on the panel, I'm sure, is aware of, that we have a relatively concentrated build out of our renewable resources, particularly wind generation, which is highly concentrated in the mid-continent. And this has incentivized and prompted some investment in transmission. Major utilities are investing quite a bit, to the tune of around 20 billion. There's a lot of money in the Build Back Better, which is probably not going to happen, but in the Bipartisan Investment Act, there's also considerable funds for transmission. But there are clearly a lot of challenges to building transmission. So a question I have for all of you is how do you sort of see this trade-off between spatially diversifying our renewable generation sources versus building a more concentrated system with a lot of transmission? And given that, regardless of our build out path forward, it's clear that we're going to need more transmission than we have. What are some of the obstacles you see to building that beyond the standard? It's very expensive to build transmission lines and the standard NIMBY type arguments that we often hear. So I'll start with you again, Dr. Kammen. What do you see as some of the options we may have here, and which path may be more preferred concentration versus spatial diversification?
Sure. So there's a lot of engineering economics models out there. The National Lab runs one, Princeton runs one, I run one, a group in California and San Francisco called E3. They all build these models, and they all come up with the same conclusion, and that is, if we could build transmission, not well, but even just at the same level of hiccups and delays that we build generation projects, this would not be a problem, because renewables can increasingly be decentralized. It doesn't mean we need less transition, but we can now weave renewables in India. They're covering the irrigation canals. California's about to start. In Netherlands are doing solar roadways. Now transparent solar that are windows. So we can greatly rely on more distributed, which means it's actually the distribution network, not the transmission one, which is going to be an increasingly important player. And almost no one, by the way, models the distribution network. We all model the big T&D systems. All that said, we do need more transmission. So there are a bunch of things that actually give me hope. Not that bureaucracy will get less, but that we will smooth it out. One is that there's an increasing effort to think about financing transmission at the same time you bundle it into some of these big generation projects. And that makes such perfect sense. I'm a physicist, not an economist, so why that hasn't been the case for decades, I don't understand. But if you start to think about that's just part of the build process, that was not possible before renewables got cheap. It's still not easy, but if you think about those as combined packages, that makes a big difference. So I worked at the World Bank and I'm now at USAID, and we routinely license big solar or wind farms. The biggest wind farm in Africa is in Kenya. And we commissioned it at the same time we commissioned a transmission line that was going to link Ethiopia and Kenya. And it goes right past the wind farm, no surprise, that it's the biggest one. So there are things that we can do here that make a difference. The other side of it is that the place where the US is really behind, yes, we need more transmission to bring Midwestern and Texas wind to the coasts, and we also need to be able to bring more big solar. But what we really need is to catch up with Europe and China, because offshore wind, while it's not siting issues free, and fish and whales do have to have a voice, we can do that in a different way. And once you start to think about large amounts of offshore wind, now you're bringing electricity when the demand is high and hydrogen when the demand is low. You're still bringing electricity, but at the shore, you're going to make green hydrogen. And so that is a whole new world of environmental impact assessments and understanding how the impacts are going to be. There's Navy, there's shipping. But California, we're talking about getting a quarter of our average demand from a sector that does not exist today. We have zero offshore wind today. We're talking about, if we can do it right, 10 or more gigawatts by the end of this decade and then rolling forward. Denmark and South Korea and Japan are all talking about similar numbers, and none of us have a hydrogen infrastructure yet. England is trying with this one big industrial hub. Now, none of these are going to be problem-free, and we're going to make mistakes, but all of them are ways to leverage and amortize in the new transmission that we do need, but also to build this more distributed economy as we go.
Yeah, excellent points. Tyler?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in with two thoughts, because I think that there's some nuance around pairing transmission with renewable energy facilities, and it's actually kind of astounding how this works. So historically, if you were a solar plant and you wanted to build a transmission line from a solar plant you were building, and several other wind or solar plants were planning to connect on that same transmission line, you couldn't figure out a way to share costs with those other generators. And this is a pretty simple fix that we could drive through regulation and policy via FERC. And I think we're going to get there. But what that has done has, created a massive disincentive for private transmission developers to actually bring those lines to market. And I think we're starting to see that the ability to sort of cost share when the cost benefit analysis is justified is going to be addressed, which I think is a very simple fix that should unlock a lot of this latent capacity. And one other thing I would say is transmission has somewhat of a dirty secret in the US. On average, and this is from some proprietary data that was collected by actually a startup that we've had some discussions with, transmission utilization on average is 20 to 30% in the US. Of course, there are lines that are much closer to that 100% capacity utilization in terms of peak relative to capacity. But in general, most lines are dramatically underutilized, and they're not employing things like dynamic line ratings, which could dramatically increase the amount of utilization that we see for the existing transmission infrastructure with relatively little investment in digital and remote sensing technologies. So I think there's just some fairly low-hanging fruit in the next year or so that could really unlock some of the logjam we have. And then longer term, I think there's bigger structural fixes that need to happen as well.
Yeah, interesting. I'd love to see that data. Neeraj, do you have some thoughts on the transmission problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think Dan and Tyler have already laid out some of the key things here, right? I mean, I think I might just add a different thought here, which is to say, right, when we typically think of transmission, right, we still sometimes use the historical paradigm that it's a thermal generation and it's the traditional transmission lines we see along the highways or whatever that connect that to a load center or a population area. But as the whole definition of energy is changing, and we're talking about solar and wind, but we're also talking about offshore wind on potentially both coasts. We're talking about hydrogen. We're talking about a variety of other ways to capture, store, transmit energy. Transmission is not just the traditional transmission lines, right? But we have an existing architecture in the middle of the country for hydrogen movement, potentially, right? I mean, there's the pipeline infrastructure or the midstream infrastructure. There's potentially problems there. Will all the midstream infrastructure work for hydrogen? We don't know. But that's another carrier for energy, if you will, to different places. There's microgrids, right? There was a study for Puerto Rico, right? After Puerto Rico was devastated with the hurricane, that do we rebuild the transmission lines, or do we think about 5 or 7 or 8 microgrids that could do the work? Now, that by itself doesn't solve the transmission problem. But the thought I would inject here is that instead of just sort of thinking about the same traditional transmission infrastructure that was based on thermal generation, I think we need to expand the box of what we say as is transmission infrastructure and all these other things, microgrids, pipeline infrastructure, they're all part of that solution kit, I would suggest. And, in some places, maybe not all over the US, it's probably harder to build transmission lines from a regulatory perspective than to build pipelines, right? And as we think about this whole changing energy landscape, I think that's what we've got to take a look at and say, well, where is maybe pipeline better? And you have a different type of energy carrier versus electricity, if you will, right? So to me, all of those have to be part of that discussion.
Yeah, very good to think about it in a much broader sense. Michael, is there some specific angles of transmission that the solar industry is really key on or thinking about how this goes forward?
Yeah, let me maybe offer two additional thoughts to what we've heard. One is, and Tyler talked about capacity utilization. There's another dirty little secret in transmission, which is the inefficiency of it. Line loss is pretty significant. And so there's a lot of room for technology innovation in actually delivering the power that you put in at the front end. We still throw away an awful lot of power. The other thing that I would mention is, and I think this applies, we've brushed on permitting challenges on transmission. We also have permitting challenges increasingly on generation. And I think there's a broad kind of socioeconomic characterization to this, which is in the last decade, we have seen the fossil energy industry decline in the US. Dan alluded to that. We've seen the renewables industry grow. Unfortunately, the jobs were lost in the US and the jobs were gained elsewhere in the world as China and others really ramped up solar manufacturing quite intentionally to gain that. And so you've got a situation where the people who are seeing this growth in solar and other things, they're seeing economic decline in their communities. And then you come and say, I want to stick this pole up in your backyard or run this transmission line through your neighborhood. And what are you getting for it? Bupkis. All you're seeing is decline. I think the more we can, and I know industrial policy is a bit of a dirty word in the US, but the more that we can make things here in the US so that people experiencing these things have a stake in that manufacturing economic growth, a lot of this NIMBY goes away. If you've got 6 family members working in solar manufacturing, somebody puts up a solar farm and you think, cool, not get that out of my backyard. And so I do think this element of diversifying the global renewable supply chain, doing more of the manufacturing here, creating the jobs, and every manufacturing job creates another 4 or 5 jobs in local community for supply and other things, would go a long way to changing how Americans think about energy infrastructure, because it would now be the smell of money.
Yeah, definitely. One part of this that, was brought up by a couple of you as well is, this doesn't have to be a large centralized utility scale only transition to a cleaner grid or electricity sector, I should say, more broadly. And certainly we've seen massive growth in small scale solar. It's more than doubled from 2017 to 2021. But there has been equity issues, market issues, traditional market structure concerns with this. So related, I would like to ask you all, what do you see as some of the challenges, both technical and non-technical, market related, regulatory related, for the expansion of more distributed renewable generation, particularly here mostly we're talking about rooftop solar. So what do you see as sort of the barriers for that growth, if there are, and sort of some of the market or regulatory reforms that are going to probably have to be considered to keep that growth going, if not expanded. So I'll go in reverse order here, Michael. I'll let you get the first crack at this one this time.
So I think one of the challenges we see, and I've done energy policy for a long, long time, and the nature of energy policy in the US is every form of energy trying to compete with every other form of energy. There's no such thing as a comprehensive energy strategy in the US. And so if you're a regulator from Texas, traditionally you've supported oil and gas. Now wind makes a difference, but if you're a legislator from the Northwest, you support renewables, and then you fight it out to see how much you can get in the bill for your particular interest. And that happens in the marketplace too. And I think what's going on in California with trying to figure out how you pay for rooftop solar and how you pay for the local transmission distribution that moves it around is a pretty clear example of that. And we're seeing that fight happen in a lot of places. And so I think a big challenge is finding a model that instead of each party at the table trying to take away as much of the pie as they can while the other guy fights for survival, finding better ways to have shared economic models. It does you no good if you make the utility pay the solar guys a whole lot of money for rooftop solar, and then they can't afford to invest in their infrastructure with this PG&E. On the flip side, it does you no good if you pay the rooftop solar guys so little it's not worth putting it on there. So finding ways to more equitably distribute the value and risk in these sorts of environments, I think, is critical to take the stickiness out of the system.
Neeraj, any thoughts on growth here and challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've touched upon this a number of times, right? I mean, some of the basic challenges we are seeing, first of all, as a background, right? We are seeing, I'm sure Tyler can speak to it as well from a capital standpoint. We are seeing just an incredible amount of capital go into community solar, C&I solar, as well as utility solar. I mean, the amount of money going in and chasing different companies and different projects is staggering. But while that's all positive and it is creating positive outcomes, some of the challenges are standard challenges that many industries, not even renewables, face, and the renewables and solar industry is going to face now. I mean, most recently, right? I mean, there is a case with the Department of Commerce about whether the panels coming from certain Southeast Asian countries are violating the tariffs because they contain components and parts from China, right? What does that mean? Now, what that means is that if that is adjudicated, right, and however it turns out, the problem we're going to have is that to satisfy, if those countries are banned from bringing those modules into the US, we're going to have a basic problem of the supply cannot be met by the modules that are produced in the US. We're going to have a big gap in terms of that module supply, right? So when we talk about the growth, and the growth is great, the problems we're going to start facing are essentially the same problems every industry has faced: supply chain issues and where the modules are coming from, right? So that case is right in front of Department of Commerce right now. 2, labor. There's also a labor issue, right? There is so much growth, but is the labor available in the right places for all these elements, right? In the right states. So the labor is going to be an issue. And I was at a conference last week, and labor availability at the right places and reskilling the workers from industries that are probably going to end up on the losing side. How do we quickly upskill and reskill these workers so the labor is available for these expanding areas is a challenge, right? And we see the positive aspects of capital going in and renewable policy standards and tariffs and et cetera, but then the basics of supply chain labor are still there, and we need to tackle those, right? So we see the growth in the US, but depending on what happens with the supply chain and what happens with the parts coming from China or certain Southeast Asian countries, Malaysia, Vietnam, that's going to create a problem.
I'll try to keep this brief and just throw in a few points that I mentioned before. In the US, it costs $3,000 to acquire a solar customer. That equivalent value in Australia is $300. There's just no reason why we shouldn't be able to install distributed solar in a much more cost-effective and economically balanced way. We think, we don't believe that policy and regulation is going to keep up with the industry. And from our perspective, that's why we're investing in software and technology companies that can help address some of these concerns, namely one, which is called Aurora Solar, which helps dramatically bring down customer acquisition costs for their solar installer customers. The other thing I would say that gives me a lot of confidence in distributed solar's ability going forward is just the rapid attachment rate we're seeing in batteries of currently 20 to 30%, but in some markets, 50% of solar arrays are coming with batteries, which will enable self-consumption and effectively, the ability to avoid some of the challenges we're seeing with net energy metering policy being sunset. At least in cases where there isn't some massive fixed charge added on to these customers' bills. So there's a couple things that that we're monitoring with respect to distributed solar. And one other thing I would say is, in general, public solar companies, we did an analysis of public solar companies, have not been particularly profitable entities. So I think there also is this flip the industry needs to make in terms of focusing purely on growth, but to focusing more on profitability. I think there's maybe 1 or 2 public solar companies that are profitable on a free cash flow basis. And from our view, that the way to strip out some of those costs and then sort of create a more powerful virtuous cycle is to adopt technology and software. And so I'll just leave you with all that.
Real quick follow-up to that. What's the key driver behind the massively higher customer acquisition cost in US versus in places like Australia?
For the most part in the US, we still have people going door to door. And in many cases, those houses that they're knocking on are not good fits for solar. There's not much done in the way of pre-screening or assessment in order to identify which houses or buildings are optimal for solar, looking at things like shading and roof obstructions and whatnot. And so that's actually one of the things our portfolio company, Aurora, they help solar companies automatically assess the payback of a solar array by using satellite imagery data and LiDAR to create a 3D model of that house and simulate what the energy production would be with 2 to 5% accuracy. And that way solar companies can pre-screen buildings before they take the big step of going out, rolling cars and trucks and sitting down at someone's kitchen table for a house that makes no sense for a solar array.
Yes.
That's just one of many contributors, but
that makes sense. I've had those conversations. Professor Kammen, any thoughts on sort of what the distributed solar world looks like and obstacles and that must be overcome to really see that explode?
Well, I mean, Tyler hit on a couple things. I mean, Angela Merkel in the UK, in Germany, used to love to say the forms, the bureaucracy to permit solar in Germany is one piece of paper, and yet you in the US have a stack of encyclopedias that goes to the roof. So we need to trim these things down. But I actually think there's no single policy tool. You should always be skeptical about silver bullets. But I do think there is something which has had a very painful birth, but would really help many of things we're talking about here. And that's what President Biden said in his second day in office. And that is we need to institute a social cost of carbon. I don't think there's any one pricing tool that's going to fix things. And there was just a Louisiana judge that was able to block the entire federal process. It just got lifted. But the idea of marrying the climate story and the social and racial justice story is one that the social cost of carbon would give us a way to do. And it brilliantly jumps over the debate over whether any one of us is more of a fan of carbon taxes, cap and dividend, cap and trade. These are all local market features, but if the federal government can get a social cost of carbon through, that we all know will be at least $50 a ton, probably more like 100, then everyone that does business with the federal government essentially has to become a climate smart business or citizen. And it would allow us to recognize the huge value in not just building more electric vehicles, but building better public transit powered by clean energy and recognizing that housing is a climate issue. There's a whole range of things that one step would enable. I don't think it's going to happen in one single piece, but it would be a way to capture a lot of the things that we've all said under one umbrella. And we finally have a FERC that is comprised of people who are actually not entirely retrograde in their thinking. There are both smart people there. There've always been smart people, but many have defended the status quo in a way that's been incredibly bad for the US energy economy. We now have, what I would say is a modern FERC. And I think that's a big deal in terms of pushing through these pieces so that we value all of these clean energy projects and we begin to penalize the ones that actually poison us.
As Sean Caston says, FERCalicious.
That's right. Well, as an economist, it's music to my ears to hear a call for pricing externalities. And given that we are up against our time limit, I think that's a great message to end on, and certainly one that myself and many other economists would love to get behind and have gotten behind for many years now. So again, thank you all, the participants here. This is really good. I could spend a whole afternoon peppering you all with questions, but unfortunately, we're already a couple minutes over. So I will just end it there and say, again, thank you to all, and hopefully this was as informative for all those online as it has been for me. John,
Thanks for an interesting conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Yep.
Just to jump in,
Appreciate it.
just to jump in real quick, this is John. Yeah, thank you panelists so much for joining. This is amazing. Dr. Fellow, thank you for moderating. And for everyone who's been listening in, we're going to like lunch break right now. So about 45 minutes of nothing going on, but we're back at 1 with our second keynote, I believe, of the day. So, you know, a little bit around 1, jump back onto Hoover and you can catch the, oh, and the case competition. Thank you, Bobby. The case competition will be being presented over lunch. So you can check that out, or you can come back at 1 for the second keynote. But once again, thank you, moderator. Thank you, panelists. This was amazing. Everyone, thank you so much.
Thank you.
See y'all.
Thanks so much, everybody.
There's all.